What I'm going to talk about today is a new Excel initiative. As all of you know, we are on our second reapplication. And as part of the reapplication this year, NIH is asking that all CTRs like Excel work with something called a PBRN, or Practice-Based Research Network. We don't have one in Delaware that's up and running, so we're actually going to develop one as well. So what I'm going to do today in just 10 minutes is talk a little bit about PBRNs in general and our ideas about how PBRNs are going to work in Delaware, and specifically how you as researchers may be able to interface with the PBRNs. I think it's going to be a wonderful opportunity for those of you who do sort of clinically based research. So PBRNs, power of networks. Networks are really important. And before I talk about PBRNs, I'm going to talk about one of the justifications for a PBRN. Many of you have heard about the research to practice time gap. So basically, here, this is a paper that actually was published almost 24 years ago. But what it said, in part, was this researchers noticed that it took 13 years for experts to recommend thrombolytic drugs in treatment of acute MIs, heart attacks, after the publication of a randomized clinical trial that showed that this therapy was effective. Treatment recommendations for new therapies appearing in medical textbooks show a delay of more than 10 years before they go into practice. So anywhere from like 10 to 13, some people even see 17 years between a clinical trial or evidence is being shown of a new therapy or a new approach to clinical care, and it actually being uptaked in clinical care. So think about that, 13 years. And when we're talking about thrombolytic drugs for MIs, we're talking about things like aspirin, and we all know how important aspirin is now for the prevention of MIs. Think about those 13 years. How many people may have survived MIs if that evidence went into practice earlier on? So this is a real big deal. And part of clinical and translational grants are to decrease this research to practice gap. So why do we have this gap? A few reasons. I'm only going to talk about a few here today, but the big one is that the research that we do isn't done in the place where people get their care, not real world settings. As we know, the majority of clinical and translational research is done in academia, not in real world settings. Even when the research is outpatient based, they're usually in outpatient practices that are affiliated with academic medical centers. And as we know, they're really important, but most people in the United States get their care not in academic medical centers. And most clinicians don't work in academic medical centers. So that's one of the reasons why there's a disconnect between where the research is done and the people who actually utilize that research, the end users. There's also poor communication between researchers and clinicians. Now, all of us who are in academic medical centers, we talk with colleagues back and forth, but in the real world, most of the clinicians really don't have access to researchers. And in fact, we even read different journals and different professional, societies, et cetera. So there's not a lot of communication. And because that research is sometimes, from the clinician's perspective, considered really narrowly focused, too complex, or it may not engage or meet the perceived needs of the practitioners and their patients. So there really is a disconnect in some ways. And I'll give you just like a stupid example. Okay. Everybody's interested in diabetes, one of the most common chronic illnesses. What are the different perspectives for diabetes information? Well, from the researcher, might be thinking about novel therapeutics, bench research, epigenetics, gene editing, et cetera, for diabetes. Really important stuff. The clinician who's seeing 15, 20 patients a day, while that stuff's interesting, what they're more concerned about on day-to-day is what's my patient's hemoglobin A1C? What's their creatinine? Are they going into renal failure, et cetera? So, they are in the same universe, but slightly different approaches. And then you take into fact the patients, they don't even care about any of that stuff. What they care about is, am I going to keep my eyesight? Is my skin also going to get better? And am I going to renal failure? Are my kidneys okay? So you can see, even within diabetes, similar, issues, but different perspectives. Yeah, I'm a social scientist, so I always think in terms of cultures. And the way I see it is that there's the medical and healthcare research infrastructure and culture. And then there's the patients and medical practitioners. And there's a real gap, there's a cultural gap between these two, I would say, cultures. One way to bridge this gap is through something called a practice-based research network, okay? And now we're going to get into what a PBRN is. So a PBRN is typically a group of primary care practices who are principally devoted to care of patients, not research, but they are affiliated in their mission to be evidence-based, to investigate questions that relate to their community-based practice and consequently improve the quality of the care that they give to patients. They understand the link between evidence, research, and care. It's united by a shared commitment to expand the base of clinical care, the scientific base of clinical care that they do in community practice, and to improve both the quality of care and patient outcomes. PBRNs are often link frontline clinicians, primary care docs, and nurses and PAs, etc., with researchers who are experienced in clinical and translational research, while also enhancing the research skills of those clinicians. PBRNs draw upon the experience and insight of practicing clinicians who identify and frame research questions whose answers can improve the practice of primary care. We'll talk later on about the difference between what's a clinical question and what's a research question. Again, we talked a little bit about that in that triangle diagram. It also shows important and efficient approaches to translating research findings into evidence-based care, and hopefully, decrease that research to practice time lag we talked about. So this is like how PBRNs are structured. Primary care practices who are interested in becoming part of the solution sign on to become a part of a practice-based research network. Okay, they stay autonomous, they still do their patient care. They just say, yeah, this is something that I would like to do within the scope of my clinical practice, is to participate in research endeavors. And then on the other side, we have researchers from academic institutions who really want to make sure that their research is being translated into care as quickly as possible. And what happens is the PBRN is really just a mechanism to share ideas between practitioners and researchers. Ideas are generated, and each practice, so ideas are generated as to what are important, both research ideas and clinical questions. Then decisions are made as to potential clinically based research projects. And each of the practices in the PBRN decides whether they specifically want to engage in that specific research idea or that specific research project. So it's not like if you sign on to be a member of a PBRN, like you are committed to doing research for every research project that goes through the PBRN. You give a thumbs up or thumbs down based on whether it fits with your needs and your patient's needs, okay? So let's say how PBRNs can really affect translational research. Well, first of all, it identifies the problems in daily practice that create gaps between what's recommended in textbooks and research and what's actually happening out in clinical care. It also demonstrates whether those treatments with proven efficacy in the medical literature are really effective and sustainable in the real world practices, not in academics. It also provides data on discrepancies between what we think of as textbook standard of care and what real world practitioners are actually doing, and whether those standards of care need to be changed based on real world situations. And it also provides an environment for testing health system improvement in primary care. We're talking about implementation science, we're talking about health services and population health research. So what are the benefits to you guys, to you researchers, in becoming a part of a PBRN process? First of all, it expands your research laboratory to real world settings. If you want the knowledge generated by your research to be uptaked in the real world, it's really important to get those real world practitioners involved in your research early on. It's better, you can recruit subjects, okay? I know that subject recruitment is quite difficult, especially if you're doing clinical trials or other clinical work and you're only affiliated with a specific medical center academic practice. Obviously, your research is going to be more impactful earlier because you're including the end user in your research from the beginning as well as at the end. And again, this is the tenets of community engaged research, right? The community here are the practitioners. And then another one is funders are really moving towards patient-centered. We all know about PCORI. But even the NIH is really requiring a community engaged perspective, which includes practitioners as well. The benefits to the clinicians are that they become partners, not end users of the research. They help identify the important questions. They're able to bring the results of the research into their practice quicker, again, decreasing that gap. It's also a way of building community among primary care practitioners. You know, most primary care practitioners out in the real world think of themselves as islands, and it's really good to network and to gain some community. And it's also great for professional development, because even if you're a busy clinician, you know, you went to medical school, you understand research, you understand science, and you really still want to be a part of that. So Delaware needs to develop a PBRN. Excel is going to spearhead that. This is what we're thinking of now. And again, we're still just in like the generation phase, so we would welcome any ideas and perspectives as we kind of hone in on this. The plan is that if we do get renewed, we'll start this in year 11 of Excel, which is July of this year. So the PBRN will hopefully consist of primary care practices from across the state, and we identify primary care as either family medicine, general internal medicine, and general pediatrics. We're initially starting with the major healthcare systems, but we want to expand it to all practices, all primary care practices in the state. And what the PBRN is, it's going to be an institution that acts as a matchmaker between these clinicians and primary care practices and institutional-based Excel researchers. Remember, we talked about this before. So like practice A, B, C, D could be, you know, Christiana Primary Care, Nemours Primary Care, BB, the VA, federally qualified health centers, etc. We really are identifying a wide variety of practices who will be involved in the PBRN. And by wide variety, we're talking about geography as well as demographics, etc. And then we have the researchers at DSU, at UD, at Christiana, Nemours, etc. So we're going to act kind of like as a culture broker between these two different groups, where ideas can be generated from both researchers and then translated into clinical questions. And clinical questions can then be taken on by researchers and modified into research questions. Okay, so we are taking this concept of PBRN, but we're going to do something a little bit different because we really believe in community engagement. Our PBRN is going to be a PCBRN, a practice and community-based research network. This is how we're thinking of doing it, and we're interested in other people's ideas about this. Every practice, primary care practice, who decides to enter into the PBRN will identify a community that's important to that practice. That community could be geographically located. It could be a racial ethnic group that they mostly care for. It could be a specific clinical condition that they care for. Like, for example, if practice A does a lot of diabetes, they might want to bring in somebody from the diabetes community into the PBRN. If they are a Latino clinic or Latinx clinic, they may want to bring in some Latin community organization. So every practice will identify a community partner, and that community partner will be invited into the PCBRN as well. And again, the PCBRN will act as a matchmaker between the clinicians, the community, and the researchers. So again, in this little diagram where we're going to bring together the health researchers and practitioners, we're also going to enfold the community in it as well. And finally, you know, you think about this research proposal. The great idea about this is, number one, an idea can be generated from the community, from the clinician, and from the researcher. And the great idea is that that idea will then be vetted to the other different cultures within the PBRN and will gain insight. So a researcher's clinical question can then be vetted to the clinician saying, you know, that's really interesting, but, you know, what we see every day is X, Y, and Z. And can you modify your question to include the outcomes that matter to us? Same thing with the community. The community might say, hey, we're really interested in, you know, vaccine acceptance. And so the researchers say, that's interesting. You know, we do vaccine work and maybe we can offer this perspective, and the clinician then can offer this perspective. So the idea is that ideas will be generated from all different groups, but it will be like molded so that everybody's interests are included in the research. And we'll have teams of research, we'll have research project teams that will include community, clinicians, and researchers. This is just the overall idea that we have. We're hoping to move forward with this, but I would love everybody's ideas and suggestions, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.